The 2022 Blitz Championship had Magnus Carlsen competing against his longtime rival Karu Nakamura, a fight for the title of World Blitz Champion. Magnus faced off against Richard Rapport in the 14th round, someone who always plays for the win and is willing to risk it all to achieve success. This match would leave the whole chess world in shock, with chess engines saying Magnus had less than a 1% chance of winning. The game opened up with a French defense opening. Magnus will put both of his center pawns on the 4th row, and Rapport will respond with e6 and d5. Magnus will then make his knight available by going c3, and Rapport will immediately stop the knight from moving by going bishop to b4, pinning it to the king. Magnus then asks Rapport a vital question by going a3, making Rapport choose whether he wants to keep the bishop or break Magnus's queenside pawn structure by trading the bishop for the knight. Rapport doesn't even think about it and immediately choose to be the aggressor and take the knight. Magnus takes a second, playing around with a bishop in his hand, trying to figure out what's the best way to move forward. He decides to launch an attack on the other side of the board, first by going h4 and then following up with h5, threatening to make life very uncomfortable for Rapport if he chooses to castle. Rapport blocks Magnus by going h6, and Magnus finally develops his second knight with the move f3. Rapport pushes his b-pawn and Magnus goes for the check with bishop b5. Rapport blocks it with his own bishop and Magnus slides back to d3. Both sides chooses to continue their development by bringing out the bishops, knights, and Rapport deciding to castle queenside. Magnus sees this and immediately goes on the offensive, completely rerouting his knight, first going back to h2, then f1, and finally arriving on e3. This gives Rapport time to further secure his own position. Even though the position is pretty much equal, Magnus is taking a lot longer to find these moves and is already down an entire minute, something completely out of the ordinary for the Time Master himself. Rapport is playing a near perfect game, increasing the gap in time with every move. On move 21, Magnus is an entire 90 seconds behind. This is a huge disadvantage. At this point, Magnus decides to step on the gas. First, he goes bishop f3, x-raying the king, forcing him to retreat. Both players decide to use everything available to them to put pressure on the center of the board. Magnus goes queen e2, Black's rook goes c8, White rook slides to b2, and Rapport goes knight b5. At this point, the tension reaches a boiling point, and the entire game explodes. Magnus decides to sacrifice his knight, forcing the game to open up, and then gives a discovery check by pushing his pawn forward. Next, he takes the f7 pawn, leaving his own pawn on the second last row, threatening to promote. Next, Magnus sacrifices the rook. Which reminds me, could you sacrifice a second, hit the like button and drop a sub? Much appreciated. Now back to the game. Rapport trades with his knight, opening up the check on e7 for Magnus. Rapport moves his king to h6 and Magnus takes the knight. Magnus is down to his last 40 seconds, so he needs to get something going right now. He threatens a checkmate by pushing his a pawn. Rapport easily defends by going knight c7 and sets off a trap of his own. First, Magnus takes Rapport's knight on f7. Rapport moves his light square bishop to e4. Magnus retreats his bishop back to f4. Rapport trades bishops, opening up the e4 square for his queen, pinning the king to the rook, leaving Magnus no way to stop Rapport from taking his last rook, a move that would end the game for any player except for Magnus. He immediately starts a counterattack by checking the king, forcing him back, pushing the pawn, forcing me into the corner. Magnus knows if he can just get his queen to b7 it will be checkmate, but in a split-second decision, Magnus rushes and pushes his pawn, promoting to a queen, a move that would end up being a mistake. This opens the gate for Rapport to start an attack of his own and check the living hell out of Magnus. Rapport gives Magnus 11 consecutive checks, a series of moves that would leave Magnus picking up his king from the board, looking like he's at a loss for moves. At this point of the game, Rapport has a rook and a pass pawn, versus Magnus who has an active king and 2 pass pawns. Rapport promotes to a queen and Magnus immediately gets one of his own. Rapport starts a check assault again and gives Magnus 14 checks in 13 moves, forcing his king to dance around the board, trying to force a blunder out of Magnus. One mistake and Magnus is done for. But Magnus just doesn't budge, making sure not to line up his king and queen. And on move 65 of the game, Rapport makes a vital mistake, moving his queen to e8, allowing Magnus to make a second queen, giving him such a big advantage. Because every check Rapport gives now, Magnus can easily defend and begin his own attack on Rapport's king. Magnus did not waste a second, because 6 moves after his second queen, Rapport is faced with checkmate.